Hi everyone, in this video I'm continuing to take a look at question 14 part C of the 2020 Baulkham Hills Extension 1 trial exam. So this part C has two subparts and I've already worked through the first in a separate video. So if you haven't already seen that, definitely take a look. This part 2 follows on directly from that part 1. We're told to consider now a library with n different books where there are p identical copies of each of these n books on one shelf. So basically what we worked out in part 1. In part 1 we worked out the number of ways you could do that. We're then told that the library barcodes each book differently to keep track of each book in its catalogue. So now kind of what we're dealing with is the fact that these p identical copies of each book, whilst they're identical, you know, from the perspective of someone who wants to read a book, they are distinguishable from the perspective of kind of keeping track of them and scanning them out and using barcodes. So part 2 says, suppose you want to borrow at least one book from the shelf, but you don't want to borrow multiple copies of the same book despite the different barcodes, which hopefully makes sense. I mean, if you're borrowing books, you don't care if they've got different barcodes. From the perspective of reading, if it's the same book, you don't need more than one copy. So the question we're asked is, in how many ways can this be done? In how many ways can we borrow at least one book, making sure that we're not ending up with more than one of the same title? And we're given this clarification at the borrowing desk. The librarian will scan out copy 1 of book A differently to copy 2 of book A because they have different barcodes, which I think was already clear anyway. So yeah, let's take a look at this question. So I've written out the basic facts. We've still got our n different books, and we've got p copies of each, but now these copies are unique because of the barcoding. And what we want to do is know how many ways we can borrow at least one book, but without multiple copies. So again, just like I did with part 1, I think drawing up a little diagram might be helpful, just so it helps us kind of get our head around what we're dealing with. So here I've called it book 1 as I guess the first of the n different books or different titles. We've got book 2 again, book 3 and so on, and you keep going up to the nth title, and for each of those we repeat them p times. So we'd have another book 1 and then another book 1, and you keep going, and you'd repeat that p times. So again, across the top here we've got n different options, and down each of those title options we've got p duplicates. So you could kind of think of the barcoding system as almost adding another identifier. So you'd have B1A, B1B, B1C, and so on, all the way down to B1, well, if we've got P of them, you'd call it B1P. And you do the same for B2 and B3 and so on. And what we want to do is we want to think about how we can borrow. We want to borrow at least one book. And so the question is, how can we do that? Well, one way to think about it is for each of these titles, ask ourselves, what are our options? So for example, for B1, in this scenario, what are our options with B1? Well, we could have none of them. I mean, we don't have to have one of every title. We want at least one book, but not at least one of every title. So we could have none of B1, or we could randomly pick the A version of B1, or we could randomly pick the B version or the C version, and so on, or we could get up to the P version. So for book 1, our possible choices are all of these, of which there are P plus 1, because we've also got that option of not picking any. So really there's P plus 1 ways that we can deal with our first title. And then for our second title, it's pretty much the same. We don't have to pick it. Or we could get the A version or the B version or the C version and so on up to the P version. And so again, that's another P plus 1 ways that we can do that. And you repeat that process up to the BN title. And again, it's 0, A, B, C, and so on up to P. So another P plus 1 ways. And so our kind of starting point in terms of thinking about this is we can say the number of ways that we can borrow at least one book is it's going to be the p plus 1 ways we can deal with book 1 times the p plus 1 ways we can deal with book 2, and so on, up to the p plus 1 ways we can deal with book n. But we can't just stop there, because with all of these options that we've combined, all of them had the possibility that we don't pick any. So somewhere amongst all of that is the 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 option, and that's not an option we can have, because we need at least one book. So we can have 0, 0, 0, 0 and so on, as long as one of them isn't 0. So basically all of these are fine, except we just need to take out that one option that involved all of them being don't take any. As long as that one is taken away from our possible set, then we're good. So if we want to simplify this, we could then just write it's p plus 1 to the power of n, because we did this n times, and then minus 1 to just take away this option where we haven't picked any of anything, because we need at least one book. And that's pretty much it. That's how you can answer that question. So hopefully that made sense. I mean, in the context of an exam, obviously that's all you have to do, not a huge amount of working. But outside of the exam context, for your own kind of learning and just kind of solidifying the ideas, if you wanted to, you could actually pick an example, you know, like just pick an example where the numbers are small enough that you could actually work through all the combinations. So for example, you could say, I want n to be equal to 2, and I want p to be equal to 2. So I've got 2 titles and 2 copies of each. So what would that give us? We'd get the number of ways being p plus 1, so it would be 3, or 2 plus 1 to the power of n, 2, minus 1. So what's that? That's 9 minus 1, or 8. So basically for that simple example, we're dealing with 8 combinations. That is not a difficult thing to draw up. You could actually, you know, say, well, this is what I'm dealing with. Let's draw up all the different ways we could get at least one book. And see, are there 8 ways, and does that work out? And then maybe you might want to expand it again. You know, as long as you don't deal with numbers that are so big that, you know, you'll spend forever drawing up all the combinations, it's not a bad idea to give it a go. Just do it the long way and see if it works. And maybe that helps solidify for you what's really going on, so that when you encounter something like this in an exam, you can just kind of deal with it in generic terms without actual numbers. So that's probably all there is to say on this question. Hopefully that process made sense. I think the difficult thing with all of these questions is kind of knowing how the subtle tweaks in the wording affects what you're meant to do. Because for part 1, we had the copies being totally identical, and so the number of ways we could do what we wanted to do was we used this technique and basically these ideas. And now with that slight change of, you know, we're barcoding them, and now we want to pick out at least one book, so it's a slightly different scenario. We need a different approach. And so I think with these kind of combinatorial questions, these topics where we have, you know, the number of ways to do certain things, the key to it is practice, just lots and lots of practice and getting exposure to as many different ways that these questions can be worded as possible, so that when you finally come to your high stakes exam, you've kind of increased the chance that whatever's put in front of you, you've seen something like it before, so that you can have I guess the best possible chance that you're going to know what to do. Alright, hopefully you found all that helpful, and tick boom.